What if the place you thought was the safest suddenly became a trap? A nightmare waiting to unfold. It was a regular Wednesday afternoon at Westbrook High School, the kind of day that drags on endlessly. Sarah sat in the library, surrounded by the soft hum of students typing on their laptops, flipping through pages of textbooks. It was the perfect environment for focus, but Sarah's mind kept wandering. She had a chemistry test next period, but all she could think about was how she couldn't wait for the day to be over. Then, the intercom buzzed to life. "Teachers, please initiate a lockdown procedure immediately. This is not a drill." The room froze. The librarian, Miss Harding, stood at the front of the room, her face instantly drained of color. The relaxed atmosphere shattered as students began to whisper nervously. Sarah's heart started to race. Lockdowns weren't uncommon, but they had always been drills. Something about the tone of the announcement made her stomach churn with unease. Miss Harding quickly rushed to lock the doors and draw the blinds. "Everyone, get under the tables, away from the windows," she instructed, her voice calm but strained. Sarah followed her orders, sliding under a nearby table with two other students. The library, once filled with the faint rustling of papers and quiet chatter, fell into an eerie silence. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Sarah tried to focus on the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, but all she could hear was the rapid beating of her own heart. She kept her phone clutched in her hand, her finger hovering over the power button, just in case. Her mind raced with possibilities. What could be happening outside? Was it an intruder? A student gone rogue? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Suddenly, a soft tapping sound echoed from the door. It was so faint at first that Sarah thought she imagined it. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head to the door, and her blood ran cold. Someone or something was outside. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Miss Harding stood up, her body tense as she approached the door cautiously. The rest of the students watched, their eyes wide with fear. Then came the voice, low, pleading, "Help me. Please, open the door." Sarah recognized the voice immediately. It was Jason, a boy from her biology class. But something wasn't right. Jason had been absent for the past 2 days, and his voice, it sounded different, like it was strained or forced. She looked over at Miss Harding, who hesitated, her hand hovering near the door lock. "Please," Jason's voice came again, more desperate now. "It's me, Jason. I need help." Sarah's pulse quickened. She remembered Jason texting her the day before, saying he was sick. How could he be here now, outside the library? And how did he know she was inside? Panic gripped her. Something about this didn't make sense. Miss Harding didn't move. Her hand trembled as she slowly backed away from the door. The tapping stopped. Silence fell once again, thicker than before. Sarah could barely breathe. She felt a chill run down her spine as if they were being watched. For what felt like an eternity, no one made a sound. Then, without warning, the doorknob jiggled violently. The door shook as if someone or something was trying to force it open. The librarian pressed her back against the door, holding it shut. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end. Eventually, the rattling stopped, and whoever had been outside seemed to disappear. But the tension remained, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. When the lockdown was finally lifted 2 hours later, Sarah could hardly believe it. They were told that the school had been secured, but there was no mention of Jason. He never came back to school. Sarah later found out from his friends that Jason had been reported missing the day before the lockdown. The police searched for him but found no trace. To this day, Sarah can't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside the library that day wasn't Jason. It had his voice, but it wasn't him. It was a cold, rainy morning when the lockdown alarm rang at Millwood Middle School. Ethan was sitting at the back of Mrs. Reynolds' classroom, doodling absent-mindedly in his notebook. He hated mornings like this, with the gray sky casting a gloomy light into the room. But what he hated even more was the sudden announcement blaring through the intercom. "Teachers, please lock your doors. This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is not a drill." Mrs. Reynolds immediately moved to lock the door, pulling down the blinds and instructing her students to hide under their desks. The routine was familiar, but this time it felt different. There was a seriousness in the principal's voice that hadn't been there during the drills. Ethan's heart raced as he crawled under his desk, his back pressed against the cold tile floor. The entire class fell silent, save for the occasional rustle as someone adjusted their position. Ethan stared at the legs of the desk in front of him, his mind racing. Was there someone dangerous in the school? He didn't want to think about it, but the possibility loomed over him like a dark cloud. Minutes passed, then more. Ethan's anxiety grew with every second of silence. He glanced around the room and noticed that Mrs. Reynolds had taken a seat behind her desk, her eyes fixed on the door. She looked tense, her fingers drumming lightly on the desktop. That's when Ethan heard a faint noise from the hallway. It was so soft at first that he thought it might just be his imagination. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. His blood turned to ice. He looked up at Mrs. Reynolds, who was now standing, her body rigid. The noise grew louder, closer. Someone or something was out there. Ethan could see the tension in Mrs. Reynolds' face as she approached the door, careful not to make a sound. The scraping stopped, replaced by soft footsteps. Slow, heavy. The doorknob turned ever so slightly. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. Was someone trying to get in? The door was locked, but the thought of someone, or something, on the other side filled him with dread. Then, a voice. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's Officer Carter. We're clearing the building. Open up." Relief flooded the room. The students began to whisper, the tension easing ever so slightly. But something felt off. The voice outside. It didn't sound quite right. Ethan's mind raced. He had met Officer Carter before, and this voice, it was similar, but something was wrong. Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. Ethan's heart raced as he watched her, torn between relief and terror. "Don't open it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Reynolds paused, looking back at him, her face pale. The voice came again. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's safe. Open the door." But Ethan knew. He didn't know how, but he just knew. That's not him." Henri whispered, more urgently now. "Please, don't open the door." Mrs. Reynolds' hand trembled as she backed away from the door. The footsteps retreated, slowly, down the hall. The room was silent once more, save for the pounding of Ethan's heart. When the lockdown was lifted, they learned that Officer Carter had been found unconscious in his car. He had never entered the building. Whatever had been outside their classroom that day wasn't Officer Carter. Maple Ridge High School was a massive campus, and on any other day, Anna loved it. She loved how there were always places to explore, corners to hide in when she needed a break from the chaos of high school life. But today, that sense of freedom felt like a trap. Today, everything felt different. It was during gym class when the lockdown announcement came over the intercom. Anna had just finished running laps around the gym when the loud voice made her freeze in her tracks. The gym teacher, Coach Davis, immediately took charge, ushering the students into the locker room. Everyone inside, quickly, locked the doors. Anna, along with her classmates, filed into the cramped space, the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the cold tile walls. The mood shifted dramatically, from laughter and chatter to tense, uneasy silence. The door to the locker room clicked shut, and Coach Davis turned off the lights, leaving them in near darkness. The only light came from the small emergency exit sign above the door. The shadows it cast seemed to dance on the walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. Anna huddled with her best friend Liz in the back corner of the locker room, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Do you think it's real this time?" Liz whispered. Anna shook her head, unsure. Lockdown drills were normal, but something about today felt off. There was a strange tension in the air that she couldn't shake. Minutes passed, then an hour. The silence was suffocating. Anna's mind wandered as she tried to focus on anything other than the eerie quiet. Her thoughts were interrupted when a faint noise reached her ears. It sounded like footsteps, but they were too soft, too deliberate. "Do you hear that?" Liz whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Anna nodded, her pulse quickening. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone was walking down the hallway, just outside the locker room. Coach Davis motioned for everyone to stay quiet, his finger pressed to his lips. The footsteps stopped outside the locker room door. Anna held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder. "Coach Davis, it's Principal Walker. It's safe now. Open the door." Anna looked at Liz, her heart racing. The voice sounded like Principal Walker's, but there was something off about it. Coach Davis hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Please open the door. We need to clear the building," the voice said again, more insistent this time. "No," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Coach Davis glanced back at her, uncertainty in his eyes. He took a step away from the door, just as the doorknob began to jiggle violently. The students gasped in unison, huddling together as the door shook. "Open the door now," the voice outside demanded, but this time it was different, darker, angrier. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The locker room was silent once again. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the terrified students. When the lockdown was lifted later that day, they were told that no one had been outside the locker room. Principal Walker had been in the main office the entire time. Anna never found out who or what had been outside that door.